Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Isaiah Hilario, and my group just had a vertical merger case, specifically the Paramount antitrust case of 1948. And so, just give you a general idea of what the article specifically goes into. So the goal of the article was basically to empirically examine the impact of this case on ticket prices using a unique data set collected from Variety between the years 1945 to 1955. And what the author does is he relates these findings to the idea of vertical integration and how it could have caused lower prices. And he also uses or goes into studies from other professors and researchers and how those relate to his findings specifically and support his case and findings. And now moving on. So just to give you a quick background into the movie theater industry at the time, just so you kind of have an idea of what was going on at the time and what I'm talking about. So prior to the Paramount case, the 8 largest studios controlled and had interest in 3,137 of the 18,075 theaters at the time in the US, which may not seem like a big number since it's only a fraction of the 18,000. However, they controlled 70% of first run theaters in 92 of the largest cities in the US. So at the time, what first run theaters were, since that's not really a thing anymore, they were basically the movie theaters that would get the movies first. They would get first dibs. And then once they were done showing them, they would pass them down to second run theaters and then third run theaters and so on and so on. So first run theaters are by far the most valuable. And aside from owning these first run theaters and theaters in general, they also use something called block booking. So these contracts were contracts with independent theaters for screen space, and they bundled movies in blocks, exhibitors, and specified a revenue split for all movies in the bundle. And they also used something called minimum price clause, which could be found within these contracts. And this was used to constrain downstream exhibitor behavior. So basically to restrain the exhibitors and the independent theaters from lowering their prices. So it's basically just another power move by the major studios to gain even more power than they already had. And also the industry was mainly composed of 3 types of agents. You heard me say exhibitors earlier. So there were studios who obviously they made movies. There were distributors who were the middleman basically between studios and exhibitors. And then there were exhibitors who were the ones selling the movies in the theaters and selling the tickets to viewers and so on. So now up to when the case is actually being filed. So the case was filed following one of the worst years in Hollywood, and it was filed by the Department of Justice, who were accusing the studios of restraining trade. And so the first reason that they had for accusing the studios were the studios used block booking, which I talked about earlier, to screen their movies and limit entry by independent studios. Secondly, they used their own theater branches to gain market power in the theater market while driving other studios and exhibitors out of business. So these were the 2 biggest reasons that they had for accusing the 8 major studios. And by 1946, the district court had the first ruling, and they ruled against the studios and banned bundling, but they allowed studios to keep their theater branches. So they still had control of the theaters at this point. However, then by 1948, the case moved along to the Supreme Court, and they ruled against the studios in May of 1948 and decided to ban bundling and also force the vertical separation of theaters from the parent studios. So this is now when they're not being allowed to own their own theaters and basically have way too much market power within the industry. And now moving on to the aftermath of the case. So as a result of this case, of this ruling, exhibition contracts are now specified to movie and theater and specify movie-specific revenue sharing terms. And by 1952, Paramount, Warner, Fox, and basically most of the major studios have signed a decree basically to move the case along and they were signing a decree in hopes of keeping a share of their theaters. So basically they knew they were on the losing side and were just trying to find any way to salvage any of their assets. And in short, the case changed the organization of distribution and exhibition in the motion picture industry in two ways. First, studios are not forced to distribute and contract their movies one by one, increasing transaction and search costs for everybody involved. And second, the number of transactions increased because theater ownership by studios was prohibited. So it took away a lot of the power that these major studios were having at the time and made the market a lot more fair for everyone involved. Besides, the studios, but they didn't need all that power. So now moving on to how the vertical integration could, in this specific industry, could decrease prices. So first, the author finds that vertical integration may decrease prices due to the elimination of double marginalization. And he partly took this from another researcher, like I talked about earlier, named Spegler, who had a study in 1950. And just to not use much jargon, what double marginalization refers to is the distortion caused by successive markups of independent firms in a distribution channel. And this implication is that this both reduces firm profits and harms consumers. And this is what is known as double marginalization. And this is what vertical integration eliminates in order to decrease prices. And a second reason vertical integration may lower prices concerns technology spillovers. So vertical integration typically increases productivity, which leads to firms being able to sell lower prices. And the author also kind of uses a study done by Hortexu and Severson, and who found that productivity advantages associated with better and more efficient use of technology and logistics. And now moving on to how vertical integration can increase prices. So the author goes into how vertical integration may increase prices by softening downstream competition when upstream firms are forward integrated into the downstream market and enjoys a non-legible degree of market power. So the evidence on this spreads across many different industries, such as gas stations, video games, hotels, among others. And just to go into a little more specifically what is meant by upstream and downstream. So the upstream process refers to activities gathered at the initial stage of manufacturing. So in this specific industry, the equivalent would be when the movies are being made, so at the studio part. And then downstream process refers to basically the retailing of the product. So that would be then the movie theater side, or what I said earlier, I guess studios are at the upstream section, theaters are at the downstream. And now going into the data used, so it might seem weird that the data used is from an old Variety magazine, because I don't think anyone thinks of Variety as a reliable source of data or just for anything professional, really. Or maybe that's just me, but at least nowadays it's not something it's really known for, more entertainment purposes. But at the time, Variety was really the only reliable source of info in the movie theater industry, because remember, this was 1945 to 1955. This was not a long time ago, but quite a while ago in terms of how young the movie theater industry was at the time. And so because the number of theaters in cities changed weekly, the data set was unbalanced. However, there was still a lot of theater repetition in the data, which allowed the author to use the data within theater variation. So he basically had to work with what he had and make sure he was picking the data that actually made sense and wasn't just all over the place. And yeah, that's it for my part. And now passing on to my next group member. Thank you.
In terms of empirical evidence, the first method used was cross-sectional regression analysis between vertical integration in ticket prices, box office revenues, and admissions. The first finding from this method was that integrated theaters charged on average 5 cents less per show than independent theaters. The second finding was that integrated theaters collected higher box office revenues and admissions than independent theaters. However, this could be due to, in large part, lower opening costs for integrated theaters. The second method of evidence that was used was the analysis of time trend changes after divestiture. Some of the findings from this method was post-separation, previously integrated theaters increased prices faster than under integration and at the same rate as independent theaters. Unlike prices, admissions and revenue decreased at an equal rate for integrated and independent theaters. The third method of evidence used was the difference in differences controlling for city-specific time trends. The first finding from this method was that due to uniform pricing in this industry, there would not be significant immediate price decreases post-separation. The second finding was that admission sales dropped faster post-separation for integrated theaters, but revenue from box office drops at an equal rate between integrated and independent theaters. The last piece of evidence used were robustness checks regarding movies played in theaters owned by the same studio. And the first finding was that ticket prices in integrated theaters dropped 3.5 to 4.4 cents, regardless of which studio owned the movie. And the second finding was that integrated theaters received higher admissions and box office revenues, regardless of which studios owned which movies. And the last finding was that strategic divestiture, aka studios selling off theaters post-separation at profit maximizing points, did not affect ticket prices in the market. These are some of the key takeaways I wanted to bring up in terms of empirical evidence in this article. The first one is that integrated theaters charge lower prices than independent theaters, leading to higher admissions and box office revenues. After separation, previously integrated studios will have to raise prices faster than under integration. Uniform pricing prevents immediate price changes post-separation in this industry. Strategic divestiture did not affect prices. Integrated theaters that played movies owned by the same studio did not affect ticket prices, revenue, or admissions compared to movies that were not owned by that studio.
It's difficult to find data over time in price changes post-division for a multitude of reasons. The first being due to the nature of the price stickiness in the theater industry. Theaters kind of charge verbatim prices across all the films and likely don't even change within a year. They typically had fixed price changes for year-long increments, which is kind of different from like airline industries where you can see price changes just depending on the week. They're all drastic all over the place. It's also hard to compare differences in prices between independent and integrated theaters because oftentimes independent theaters will increase prices following the price changes of formerly integrated theaters. So they'll kind of level out. It also takes up to 4 years to see price changes that were specific to changes in management specifically, which is apparent across all theaters with various reasons for each one in terms of management. Okay, so specifically for Paramount, they had slow price reactions and management changes for possibly various reasons, with stock being probably the most important. Leonard Goldenson was the manager of the theatrical division and reorganized United Paramount Theaters after the division and before becoming its president. And after the company had split, they had dual management, which made it so that no stockholder could receive shares of both companies, which would make sense. I mean, they're separated. But despite this, no limitations were made on whether or not the stockholders could invest in both stocks in the open market. So essentially, all the top executives had purchased open market stock in both companies and would have no reason to change anything in management. So, you didn't really see many changes there. It's also hard to argue that divested theaters, other than Paramount, experienced changes in management because vertical integration allowed for the sharing of management practices across theaters at a local level. In other words, post-division, why would these theaters dispose of managers and management practices if they still cut costs post-division? It wouldn't even make any sense for them to change anything. Another reason for slow price reaction is that it's simply just kind of a terrible time in Hollywood after the division. Output for entertainment, whether it be films or theatrics, was unusually slow after division. One major factor to also consider is the ban of block booking. All theaters, regardless of whether or not they were integrated, independent, or formally integrated, would equally compete and show all firms and all films and top movies, which would make you believe that prices would level across all theaters, but it was instead found that previously integrated theaters would raise prices more quickly than others, which I think uncoincidentally might fall in line with the idea that elimination of double marginalization lowers prices.
Concluding remarks. Aside from the intellectual value of the research question, this study is also valuable in that the Paramount case is one of the largest and most important cases in the US antitrust history, and therefore understanding the ultimate consequences of its resolution at the outlet level is key for future antitrust policy design. The empirical findings showed that integrated theaters charged 4 cents less for evening shows on average than independent theaters, and that they charged, statistically speaking, the same prices after studio separation. Other results suggest that even though integrated theaters sold more admission tickets and collected more revenues than independent theaters, no difference existed in the rate at which sales and revenues decreased across theaters of different organizational forms. Therefore, future work should examine the relation between vertical integration and product development, along with product placement, using this antitrust case as an empirical application, because these decisions are important sources for consumer surplus and welfare.